It gives me great pleasure to introduce Antonia Darder who's joining us from Los Angeles. And if my time calculation is right, it's something like 7:20 in the morning. I'm an early riser, but I'm not even sure. And you've been with us for at least an hour. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Antonia. As people know, and hopefully you were able to see from the note that I circulated, and I'm sure that people knew of Antonia's work before, the significance of Antonia's work as a activist scholar and as an artist. And that is, as I understand it, in terms of not separate but woven together in Antonia's work. And I would encourage, if you haven't, to have a look at Antonia's website, which I added to the link, and I found that and the references to Frida Kahlo and her work really fascinating. So Antonia's work and contributions to critical and radical education is really important for us in terms of the themes that we've been exploring. Antonia is going to be going into dialogue with one of our colleagues, Jo Forster, who has been a central member of our research circle since we first met. And Jo's work is located particularly in the northeast of England, but as Jo has undertaken her doctoral studies at the University of Edinburgh and has written about that, obviously within and since her PhD. So what I would like to do is extend that welcome to Antonia and to Jo, to hand over to Jo and Antonia for the next half an hour, and then we will reconvene our discussion groups and pick up on the themes that we've been already exploring this afternoon. So Jo, can I hand over to you, if that's okay?
Yes, thank you, Ian. Welcome, Antonia. Thank you for accepting the Research Circle invitation to come and join us today. Your voice has always been one that can steer us into a more engaged and thoughtful conversation about how to improve society through a Freirean approach to education. And we've heard Colin speak and visualize on how he interpreted Freire's pedagogical approach to education in the context of his communities. Paulo Freire told us he didn't want us to his work to be copied, but to be reinvented within our own context. And Antonia, I wonder how you could tell us how you have gone about interpreting Paulo Freire's approach to education in your work, especially in these critical times of crisis that we're in.
You're muted, Antonia.
All right, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
All right,
Yep.
Thank you. Apologies. I thank you so much, Jo, for that, and all of you. Thank you for the research group for having me be able to join you today. I think that I mean, there's so much that I'd really like to share, and always, in this short time, we'll try to do what we can. But Jo, in terms of responding to your question, one of the biggest issues for me around reinventing Paulo Freire was to really understand questions related to power, culture and power, and particularly from the standpoint of being a subaltern colonized subject of the United States. I was born in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico continues to be a colony of the United States. It creates a very strained relationship in our community, and but also, my work extends beyond my community in the sense of a world community and different places where people are struggling in order to be able to exist and to allow their own cultural beliefs and their ways of being and their humanity to be engaged as legitimate, and rather than being always subjected to having to present oneself in a way that is comfortable to those who come from the so-called first world. And what we're talking about is the way that racism works, but also class inequalities work in ways that structure relationships that keep people being identified and viewed as if they're the whole superior inferior aspect. And I always think about it, for me, it was a sense of that somehow if we were not part of the dominant elite culture, we somehow were ahistorical, we were apolitical, and we were anti-intellectual, as if our co-production of knowledge, or the way that we produce knowledge within our communities or our churches or our workplaces or our families even, did not have the same legitimacy. And people had to come into our communities and show us what education really should be, or show us what living a decent life, even showing us how to eat. I mean, things of that sort. So talking to us about nutrition, I mean, the crazy thing about it is people would come into our communities to teach us how to eat, what food we should eat, right? But interestingly, now that people are all vegetarian, they used to make fun of us for eating rice and beans, because rice and beans were such a major part of our meal, but partly it was cultural, but partly it's what we could afford. And now, to see people with the whole, fad of, plant-based diets, and people talking about how eating rice and beans. And I remember when people made fun of us and made us feel that somehow our eating, the way we ate, was inferior. I think it's a really good example of how and I hope to be able to say a few words about this, at the end, but how we have to struggle against the ideology of modernity that has been about this kind of progress and also democracy, but a democracy that has been conditional. And so part of our struggle in our work, and part of my struggle of looking at the work, is really understanding how we shift the discourse, how we shift the relationships, and how we think about our participation and co-construction within power relationships that have been fundamentally unequal, within a political economy that is in fact absolutely requires impoverishment of the majority of the world's population, living in the first world that often people are so unaware of how their comforts and their so-called freedoms actually have been built on the backs of people of color around the world, and where people continue to be impoverished and not participating, and having conversations that are difficult conversations to have, is where Paulo's work for me was important. And that was, of course, the question of dialogue. So working, as a nurse, as a therapist, as an educator, philosopher, as a cultural worker, as an activist, we use those terms. Those are different aspects of who I am, but I'm the combination of all of that, and all of the people in my life who came before me and who have been with me in this journey and who will come afterwards. And so it's a very different way of trying to understand the significance of Paulo's work, and how I work in communities when I was working in early childhood education, working with parents and with children, and this notion. I mean, I love, there was a comment that Fiona put in about the heart of a living democracy is a people. Well, absolutely, it's a people, but it means, right, I completely believe that to the very core of my being. And it means then that we have to create a kind of relationship with the people where we are part of the people. We don't see ourselves separate of the people. And so much of that work is what I think Paulo brought to the table, is a sense of how we could do that. So, working with families, with parents, with youth, Spanish-speaking youth, who would be given to me as a therapist or counselor in the school, because they were considered these kids, so I go into the classroom and see them, and they're flat affect. And the teachers would say that they were not intelligent or capable. They'd be in a group with me, and we would do it in bilingually or in Spanish, and all of a sudden it was like the light bulb came up. I mean, when children and I mean human beings, period, when we are in meaningful context where we feel that our brilliance is respected, perceived, and wanted, we respond to that, and that is a very human trait. And I feel that sometimes, that's one thing about Paulo that I loved, is he had the living praxis of his pedagogy was not just in the classroom, it was not just in the circles, but it was in every context. And so that really challenged me to really think of my life. How do I create a life of living pedagogy? So when I did my organizing work, and in terms in a social action center, we did a lot of work, community organizing around housing, immigration, education, and health issues. A lot of anti-racist work, racism work, which was really hard to do at times because of the ways in which racism is invisibilized to those who are privileged by it. And the working with doctoral students in a context that is anti-relational. The university is an anti-relational, anti-community context, and it's very elite in terms of how it constructs knowledge. So trying to use Paulo's work, bring his ideas into a living form that we could work together as a even doctoral students, as a doctoral community, a learning community, and so in everything I do, in my work with my, in my relationship with my children and my relationship with the people, I mean, the spirit of Paulo was always there for me. And I just want to say that I loved when, Colin begins his introduction to Freire, because we each have a story about our introduction to Freire. And for me, what I was most struck by, it was the first educational philosopher who spoke about love. And people talk about how hard it is to read Freire. For me, it was hard. I don't know what it was. Is that maybe I understood the context, maybe as a person who felt so oppressed economically and politically. I felt it like, oh my goodness, he's speaking to my heart. He's speaking to something I understand. So bringing that work and being able to think about it, but also then the process of reinventing it within the different contexts we're in, because the truth is that context is essential. And he made that very clear. The cultural context is essential, which then meant that there had to be, even when we talk about codification, it's not taking the codifications from one place to another. It's about understanding they're generative. They have to be organically generated within the context that we're working in, because they have to be meaningful to those who are engaging them and to those who are speaking of them. So I thought that was a very powerful piece, and has also been very much at work in what I do, as in every aspect of my life.
Thank you. That was just inspirational, and you've taken us not just into the heart of the community, but you've taken us into your heart and into your passion for your work, which is not a vocation, it's a way of life. Would you agree?
Yeah, it is definitely a way of life.
You talked about, you talked about the co-construction of knowledge in the communities, and the importance of that. And Bud Hall wrote about knowledge democracy, which means that whose knowledge counts, knowledge counts. And he questions who's creating the knowledge in the world we're living in now. What is the dominant narrative? Find a counter narrative, he calls us to challenge the dominant narrative that marginalizes and divides us, not just the oppressed, you know, the people who are fixed and in a very difficult situation due to capitalism, but totally to society in general. And in 1972, Paulo emphasized social change began with the stories of the people, and to produce theories from grassroots communities, and these enable them to challenge and produce a counter-narrative. And the universities, do you think the universities, need to really work with their communities to, in this way? I mean, I know that they do, to an extent, but does this not perhaps need to be embedded through perhaps a critical pedagogy network of universities who have a coherent approach to working in impoverished communities?
Yeah, Jo, I know we have just a very little amount of time, and so I'm feeling,
and I wondered about the neoliberal opposition.
Yeah,
but
I think
all of this.
Right. I mean, we know that neoliberalism, essentially has been a counter-revolutionary tactic of the economic elite, and it has, manifested itself powerfully and destructively within education, particularly the universities. But I wanna just say that part of our struggle is understanding that we need to move, in order to create a kind of solidarity, in order to create a new world, to really make a new world, understanding that is, first of all, understanding we need a new world, that the structures, there's still this attitude that modernity can save us. I absolutely believe modernity is the problem. We have to talk about reinventing Freire. I mean, I think that in some ways, what speaks to me here is Audre Lorde's, words where for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And this will allow us temporarily to beat him at his game, but we will never it'll never enable us to bring about genuine change. And I think she was absolutely correct. And what I see there is how, we have to understand that part of reinventing Freire's work is also understanding that some aspects were grounded in modernity, some of the notions, because historically that's where he was writing at the time. So we need to continue to take the beauty of his work and continue to expand it and develop it. As we look around the world within, whether in your university or within communities, what we become increasingly, I mean, to me, it's just so obvious, the unsustainability of today's world. So we have this world that emerged from the greed and impunities that were associated with the principles of modernity, which fiercely upholds these structures that are shaped by patriarchy, by colonization, by capitalism. So racism is absolutely inherent here. It's part of the mechanism, which fiercely then continues to create exclusions. And we see this in curricular patterns in schooling. We see it in community work, in the ways, in the logic, how the logic of modernity attempts to camouflage and negate this unsustainable global system of exploitation and extraction. If 8 people own as much wealth as half of the world, we human beings have been conditioned to believe on some level that this is common sense, and that's what we don't, some part of us doesn't want to believe that we're implicated, that we're complicit in this. So inherent in this analysis, then for me, is a manner in which we need to see how the ways that we think of education and schooling have anesthetized and conditioned us to accept that. And blame, also to accept blaming those who are poor for their own poverty, for their own impoverishment, right? So central to all this work then is this effort to consider interdependent and multidimensional lenses that disrupt modernity's ideological prison in order for us to be able to consider what it means to teach for the end of the world as we know it. This world has to change. This entails then deliberating on what it means to teach both within the midst of the process of this chaotic transition, which is what we're doing today, because if we don't think there's chaos, there's major chaos here, in order to prepare ourselves and our students and our communities for embracing new possibilities in how we define humanity, how we define education, how we define justice, and how we define collective existence in the years to come. And to me, this is vital in terms of the questions of creating solidarity, because so much of what Freire, when in conversations that I was involved with him and others, this issue of solidarity was central. But then when we're looking at the ways in which modernity itself has positioned superior populations to inferior populations, created subalternity, we have to also then struggle with the ways in which we are all positioned differently. And how can we understand the implications of our own positionality so that we can really be with communities, with students, rather than manipulating them, under some kind of auspices of neutrality, that somehow even our leftist work is neutral. No, right? We have to be questioning ourselves and willing to have that kind of hypervigilance. So there's this element, about identity politics. And I one of the things that Arundhati Roy really does well is that, she pushes back on this identity politics that is part of the problem, because she talks that the weaponization of identity as a form of resistance has become the dominant response to the weaponization of identity as a form of oppression. So part of the struggle is how we struggle in binary ways, which then keeps us stuck in the same modernist loop I'm sorry, I'm talking fast, and I know it may not make sense, right? But I hope it does.
It's okay. If you want to have a pause, Breathing space, Antonia, breathing space.
I know, there's so little.
So passionate. Antonia, in central to all of this is the interpretation of Paulo's critical pedagogy, I never get this right, and the role of the teacher within it.
Right.
And, the neoliberal, sort of inequalities that our communities experience. Could you, can we actually talk about an explanation of critical pedagogy, and if there's resistance to this from the students, or I know they're imposed with this authoritarian approach, but then when they're actually brought into this pedagogical approach of Paulo Freire's, how do they respond to that? Because it's different from authoritarian approach to education.
Well, of course, there's different ways in which students respond. I mean, they're going to respond according to their own histories, and they're going to respond to their experiences. What are their own personal histories and their own community histories, which have to do a lot with trust in the small group. Olga was, really bringing this issue up, and the way I saw it is that we have a history of distrust. If we have been always marginalized, and we have been, exploited, and our labor extracted, and our ideas, maligned. There's how we come to it. The student is coming not just as an individual; they're coming with their whole trajectory of history and their people before them. That is in their DNA. I mean, the trauma of that. So how they're going to respond is going to be so related to the relationships they've had within education, and whether it has been they could trust or not trust. But I also think that I don't want this piece to get lost, because this is where we end up separating how, praxis and theory is completely linked. I mean, if you think, I go back to this question of modernity, if we understand the logic of modernity in this, in terms of creating this notion of universalism and cultural supremacy, like there's a superior way to exist, and its conquest is, a driving force, then part of what we're seeing is an education where there's a denial of systemic, historical, and ongoing violence and complicity. There's a denial of the limits of the planet and its sustainability. There's a denial of the method of that there's different forms of knowledge production that are just as legitimate, that there is different forms of humanity that are just as legitimate. There's a denial of the entanglement of nature and human beings. There's a denial of the arrogance which drives this notion of inferiority and who's inferior and who's superior. There's a denial of the impact of psychological and physical trauma that's been inflicted by the different forms of structural oppression. There's a denial of the magnitude of the complexity of the problems we face. So you can understand that students may not be able to use those, these words that I'm using, but they're expressing their reaction to this denial. Families, communities are expressing in the ways that they can their response to the kind of deep trauma that exists as a consequence of exclusion. And the tendency is to keep thinking that we can put a damn Band-Aid on this problem. And so let's just give them, give them this education, or teach them this, or give them that, as if no, the system is absolutely, it has been created for inequality, for capital accumulation of the few. And so this means that we have to find a way then to work with our students and to understand that they're coming in, they're products, just as we are products of this madness. They're coming in, and within the collapse of modernity, we've got to see how we participate in that, within that process. Not like we wait, we're doing something for the future. No, we're doing something for right now, right here, in the ways we live, in the ways we teach, to prepare for the possibilities that can move us, that can counter the inequalities of violence, exploitation, the extractions, of this current global political and economic system of racialized capital. And so I see, students responding to this, people in communities, their distrust is meaningful. There's a number of us here who are have been educated as therapists, and I've worked as therapists, right? The one thing about, is behavior is meaningful. Human responses are meaningful. Whether we want to give it meaning or not, whether we want to legitimate it or not. So our students, if they're resisting, what we need to do is enter into that resistance with them, not push them down, not try to quiet them, or in communities. We need to listen in deep ways and engage in very deep ways in the ambiguity of life. There is no perfection. There is not a la-la land we're going to get to and all these problems are going to go away. Human beings are need to work around the way in which power is structured and relationships are structured, so that we can together construct a different way of being in a different society, a different world. And that has to have place for the multiplicity of humanity, the multiplicity of ways that we have, diverse ways that we have of expressing our minds, our hearts, our bodies, and our spirits. And when any of that is curtailed, especially young people who are more responding from this, not so much, analysis, and they're not stuck in their head. They're still, responding from their physical feeling of things. And often, how they resist is even not in their own interest, right? Because it often can be destructive to them, but that's the kind of world we've created. We've never, right now, the suicide rate among youth is like skyrocketed, and people are asking, they're still trying in the psychological way, look for the problem in the individual rather than understanding we've created this madness, and young people are the casualties of this madness.
You're talking about Paulo Freire, what he's left us to interpret about the transformation of the world, the society, not just the oppressed, but a much wider dimension to transformation. Or are you actually talking about the oppressed because of people who are treated not as full and equal human beings, but as objects or instruments to be used and dominated and controlled?
Right.
Or is it wider than that?
I mean, can we even imagine a world without those binaries? That's the question. Because those, can we imagine that? Can we even imagine in our own lives? How are we with our own relationships, with our children, with each other? Can we even imagine that? I mean, I think about, back to Arundhati Roy, one of the really, I think insightful pieces is where she says, if we lock ourselves up in the prison cells of the very labels and identities that we have been given by those who have always had power over us, we can at best stage a prison revolt, not a revolution. I'm interested in a revolution. And a revolution that understands that revolution is a living process that never stops. Because and I think that Freire, that Paulo understood this. He understood that. This is why he talked about issues of self-vigilance. That we start with our own self-vigilance. That we begin, with each other, and why we need each other. Why do we need dialogue? Why do we need to listen carefully? Why do we need to be in community? Because it's through community that our capacity for accountability, for true social political accountability is possible. In community, not in our heads, not by ourselves, not in a book. I love books, I write books and I read them, but that's not where the revolution is going to happen. It's going to happen in our relationships. And I think Paulo understood the complexity of relationships, and that we needed to build our ability to be with the discomfort of difference, to be with the ambiguity and uncertainty that is the honesty about what life is. We don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. We think we do. We create these prescriptions in our mind, but he wanted us to imagine moving beyond prescription so that we could be here and now and in every moment engage in a revolutionary way.
Thanks, Antonia. Thanks, Jo.
Can I just have 1 second? One second with Antonia. I think we haven't quite finished here. Antonia, can I actually just say that looking at the Paulo Freire's work, people like yourself have faced great opposition, even setting up small projects, sort of through formal education, and using his critical pedagogy. What seems to be happening to me, I might be entirely wrong, but we have international projects now, scattered right across the world, whether they're on climate change, food poverty, environment, health projects, well-being, women's projects, many projects. They're not labeled Freirean, but they're like a rhizome that's rooted right across the world, that are popping up all of the time in community groups, actually with really in circles, okay, using a critical pedagogy, arrangement of dialogue, love, ethics, action, that whole process. Do you think that this is where Paulo Freire has evolved to and is where he's strongest in the world, rather than often in the structures that we are fighting in at the moment of neoliberalism.
I mean, what we're dealing again, I mean, neoliberalism is the you know, the face of deep capitalism in this moment. I mean, but we know that, right? It's this political economic ideology that persists and that perpetuates within modernities. But I think that what you said about Freire gave language to what were very human possibilities. So I don't think that people have to know Freire, you know, to somehow do dialogue. I think when people have community, when they bring love, when they're working to move beyond hierarchy, when they are working to, you know, undo the superior, you know, inferior ways of looking, when they're willing to dethrone their arrogance. All of us, you know, we have to look at how we carry an arrogance. And those of us who have been educated within the West, especially in university, have to come to terms with the fact that we have been conditioned to think of ourselves as experts, whether, you know, we deny it or not. You know, there's a way in which sometimes we enter into these situations where our arrogance still, you know, it's there. And so when people respond to us, I think we need to be able to allow their response and understanding how people respond and how people work in community has, again, so much to do with their own lives and their own histories and what is meaningful. So for me, Paulo has been amazing, was an amazing philosopher. He was a philosopher. He was able to bring all these different aspects. He read, I mean, I remember being in his library and he, you know, Fromm was one of his favorites, you know. I mean, he could bring psychology, he could bring theology, he brought all of these different elements to play because he understood the multidimensionality of our humanity. And so I think in so many ways, that was one of the greatest contributions, in that he opened the door in a moment where, you know, we really needed to rethink what education was about and why it was about. What was our vision of the world? You know, and so that comes back to you know, for me always, how I teach or how I am or how I'm engaging. What is the world that I want to live in? So each of us has to carry some sense of a vision. What is the world we want to live in affectively, relationally, politically, economically? You know, in terms of our labor, what is the world we want to live in, and how? You know, how do we bring that about in our relationships and our willingness to engage?